So we're going to be talking about mostly about cements and the different type of ceramics that you utilize in dentistry, bonding to them, whether or not you can bond to them, and how to use them effectively. My main goal is to make sure that we clear up some confusion about when to use what cement. I wanted to thank Doxa. Doxa is sponsoring this webinar, and our manufacturers do a great job in making sure that these webinars can happen. Now, obviously, I use a lot of different cements, not just cements by Doxa, but Doxa is the one who is supporting this webinar. I wanted to thank them for doing that so that we could have this time together. When it comes to cementation, you might think in your practice, okay, I have a cement for certain type of ceramics, or when I have a certain type of preparation, I use this type of cementation, so I have this type of cement. Or when I'm cementing implants, I have another type of cement. So there are lots of different cements that you might have in your office, but I think that really understanding the category of the cements and how they're used can help you simplify what you use in your practice. So I want to talk about cementation technique and the cements that you are going to use. The way that I like to break up how I use my cements, so how I use my cements, one, and which cement I'm using, two, really falls under my preparation. If I have a retentive prep, normally I would just use cement. I don't have to worry about primers or priming the tooth, priming the ceramic or the tooth. Really just any luting cement is appropriate when I have proper resistance retention forms in my crown preps. So if it's not retentive, if I'm worried about the distal part of number 18, or I have short crown I have a short interocclusal space, and my crown preparation is not very large, I don't have very good ferrule, I'm worried about my resistance retention form. When any of those things come into play, then I think in a different way, because I have to think, okay, what type of ceramic am I using here? Is it a zirconia base or is it an Emax base? Now, if I'm going to use that, what type of primer for that ceramic am I going to use? Then, what type of cement am I going to use with this restoration? What type of adhesive am I going to use on the tooth? And all of these, we have to think, okay, is the adhesive dual cure? Do I need a dual cure activator in the adhesive? Is it total etch? Is it self etch? Is my cement, does that have a dark cure? Is that dual cure? Or is it only light cured? What role does chemical cure play into it? What about my primer? Is my primer, does it have MDP? Does that matter? Is it zirconia specific? Is it a glass ceramic specific? So when it's a non-retentive preparation and I'm cementing the ceramic onto my non-retentive prep, I think about a lot more things. So as often as I can, I try to simplify and first off make my preps retentive. And then my cementation procedure is also simplified. But in those situations where it's not retentive, there are a lot of things that we go through, or we should be going through in our minds to make sure that our restoration will be permanently cemented for a long time and predictably. So let's start out with the hard one. I always like to tackle the hard one first, and my prep's in the mouth or where else. Let's tackle the hard one. Let's talk about non-retentive preparation cementation. There are a lot of cements also out there, just talking about cements themselves. And I, again, like to categorize my cements under the non-retentive or the retentive category. So there are lots of different cements out there, so many different cements on the market. And the bottom line is, if you are using something on the tooth, an adhesive on the tooth that usually falls under the non-retentive type of cement. If you don't have to use an adhesive on the tooth, then that's where I would put a retentive type of cement. And so I've categorized them. For me, I see 4 major categories of cements. There are your resin cements. Now these resin cements use adhesives on the tooth. These are usually dual cure or light cure only. Okay, and these are for my non-retentive, specifically, preparations. So if it's non-retentive, I'm always using a resin cement. Now, you can use resin cements in your retentive preparations too. But for non-retentive, I'm definitely using a resin cement. And my resin cements need to have an adhesive that goes onto the tooth, not just the cement itself. Now, under these other 3 categories, the self-adhesive resin cements, resin-modified glass ionomers, and bioceramic cements, these are the types of cements I use in my retentive sets. So with my retentive preparations, these are the 3 types that I use. The reason being is that none of these have very strong bonding strengths, right? They're about 12 to 15 megapascals, maybe the 20 sometimes. But resin cements, you get much, much higher. You get around 35, 40 megapascals, very, very good bonding numbers, those adhesive numbers. Those are the ones you want. So I try to categorize my cements. I use resin cements when it's non-retentive, and then I use any one of the 4 for my retentive preparations. Okay, so I want to take a poll here, just because that's what I do. So the majority of your single unit full coverage crowns in your practice. So this is retentive or non-retentive. Okay, what do you use most of the time in your practice? Retentive or non-retentive, posterior, anterior, single unit. What are you using? All right, so here's a poll. And here it comes. So you have 4 choices. Are you using a resin cement? This is the one with the corresponding bonding agent. Are you using a resin modified glass ionomer? For example, Reliax luting is very popular. Fuji cement, that's a resin modified glass ionomer. Self-adhesive resin cements, those are like Biscem and Speedsem and Maxcem Elite and Unisem, Reliax Unisem. And then you have your bioceramics, which are just a couple, like Ceramir. We'll do a couple more seconds on this. Lots of voting taking place. Really interesting here. All right. Here we go in 5, 4, 3, 2, 1, and the polls are closed. Let's see what we got. So the majority of the time, people are using resin-modified glass ionomer cements. These would be your Reliax luting. That's a very popular one. Fujisem. That's very, very popular. Man, 51%. Now you also have that split them with your resin cements. A total etch or some type of adhesive resin cement, and then your self-adhesive resin cements. And one person there using bioceramic cement. Okay, so that's interesting to have. And now I know how to talk to everyone. That's great. Okay, so let's go on. Here's a quick, whenever my dad was a dentist too, and he said to me, "Hey, Greg, whenever you lecture, make sure you give a couple gems, right? Because that's what people are looking for. They're looking for some gems. So here's a gem right now. Whenever you are using a cement, especially resin cements, always use corresponding manufacturer, adhesive, and cement. So if you need adhesive, for example, let's say you use 3M Scotch Bond, right? Reliax Ultimate, then you should use Scotch Bond Universal. If you're using Dentsply's Calibra cement, then you should use Dentsply's Prime and Bond Elect. If you're a Kerr NX3, if you like NX3, I think NX3 is a fantastic cement. If you like NX3, you should be using either Optibond XTR or Optibond FL or Optibond Solo Plus or whatever it is, but you should use the same manufacturer's adhesive with their cement. The reason being is that the manufacturers make these cements, their chemistries all work together. Now, it doesn't mean you can't use a resin cement with different one. Like, for example, if you could use NX3 and use Scotch Bond Universal. That will work because of resin chemistry. But they won't work together as well as NX3 and Optibond XTR. For example, NX3 and Optibond XTR, when used in conjunction, have a dark cure, meaning you don't have to have a self-cure activator in the adhesive of Optibond XTR when used with NX3. Their chemistries combine to have a dark cure all the way through. So if you can't get full light cure in it, if you have a zirconia restoration and you can't get light through it for the total polymerization, then there is a dark cure that happens by itself. But if you use NX3 with Prime and Bond Elect, you won't get that. Vice versa, if you use a Prime and Bond Elect and you put a dark cure, self-cure activator in it, it might not work as well with NX3. So when you are using these systems, use it as a system. A quick question here. Someone said, does anyone use Panavia anymore? Yes, people use Panavia, and Panavia is a great cement. You know, it's by the Curare Corporation, and Curare has fantastic adhesives. I really like their adhesives. You know, their Clearfill SE is a fantastic adhesive. So Panavia is a great cement. If you're using that and having success, keep on it. Okay, so before we get back onto the tooth, let's back up and talk about, for our non-retentive cementation procedure, let's talk about our different substrates. We essentially have Emax and zirconia, and you have to treat them differently because they're made differently. Now, in my practice, I use both of these quite a bit. I use a ton of Emax and I use a ton of zirconia. And so if it's a non-retentive preparation, I have to think, okay, how am I going to prime this substrate, this ceramic, to be ready to have my cementation procedure work very, very well? So you can essentially differentiate them to whether or not they contain silica oxide, right? Glass ceramics versus non-glass ceramics. So the glass ceramics, right? Porcelains, Emax, lucite reinforced, all the glass ceramics, those are, you can etch those, right? You can etch those with hydrofluoric acid. And so when they're etchable, you use a silane primer. For those that are not glass, metals and zirconia, right? Alumina, zirconia, noble metals, you cannot etch those with hydrofluoric acid because they are not made of glass, right? And so you can, I prefer to use a zirconia or a metal specific primer. And that's, again, getting back to Panavia. Panavia always had their metal primer that everyone loved for a long time. So let's talk about the silane first. People ask me, do you really have to use a silane? When it comes to a non-retentive preparation cementation procedure, I always say yes. Use a silane. Here's a study that kind of helps me explain why I use a silane. So this one shows basically a lithium disilicate ceramic, like your Emax. And in the test, they did it without silane and with silane. And the bond strength varied all the way from 0 megapascals to 61 megapascals. Now that is a pretty significant gap. But regardless, they found that the silane primer always elevated bond strength. You can get a durable bond when using silane primers. Now, they found it the best when you would also use hydrofluoric acid to etch the inside of the glass ceramic and then use a silane primer. So I always recommend silane when using glass ceramics. Now why? What is it that silane does? Basically, silane is working on the ceramic like your adhesive works on the tooth, right? Before you bond your composite on there. So your ceramic is hydrophilic, much like a tooth, right? You have a hydrophilic surface, but your resin cements are hydrophobic. And so what you want is you want to be able to coat that ceramic much better with your cement. And so what the primer does is basically makes that cement flow, right? The primer takes this hydrophilic surface and makes it amenable to hydrophobicity or your resin. And so it flows very well, and it's really important to be able to do that with your ceramic. It works in two ways, both in a chemical nature and in a micromechanical nature. So in the micromechanical bonding, that is what the hydrofluoric acid etch is for. So the hydrofluoric acid etch basically creates this network inside, this pattern inside of the ceramic where the silane can flow into. Now, different glass ceramics require different etch times. The old glass ceramics used to require 90 seconds, they would say up to 120 seconds of hydrofluoric acid etch. For Emax, that's actually much different. It is only 30 seconds. Now, this picture that you see, let me show you here with my cursor, this here, this is over-etched. That is too much. That is too frosty. You don't want it that frosty. You want it just a little less frosty than this. It's 30 seconds and that's it. What can happen, there are different studies that show that you can actually create weakness in the Emax if you over-etch it. So you just want to do it at 30 seconds. Okay? So that's the micromechanical, because it creates this lattice formation that the silane can fill in and create that really strong bond to the ceramic. Now someone asked here, what's the difference between using hydrofluoric acid and phosphoric acid when etching the ceramic? The bottom line is that the hydrofluoric acid is much more powerful and can create this etched pattern in ceramic. You can't get that with phosphoric acid. Phosphoric acid works well on the tooth, but it cannot etch the pattern that you need to in the ceramic. So that's micromechanical. Okay, so now for the chemical portion, the silane primer, this is what we were talking about with the hydrophilic, hydrophobic portion. Essentially, you have, when you etch the ceramic, all of these ions are then released, and the phosphate groups from your primer can then have a covalent bond with the ions that are released. So you get this very, very strong chemical bond with the ceramic. So this is something that's really important. This is why you can get these very, very high bond strengths with your silane primer. because you get this covalent bond between the phosphate groups and these ions that are released from hydrofluoric acid etching. So it works in two ways, right? Both in a micromechanical with the restorative material, and then in a chemical, both with the cement and the ceramic. So silane is just a really, really great product to use because it works in so many different ways. Now, there are a lot of different silanes on the market. There are tons. Ceramic primers are crazy. They're everywhere. And a lot of your adhesives, for example, Scotch-Bond Universal, say that you can use them as a silane primer. Here are my 2 cents. If your adhesive contains MDP, if it has the MDP monomer, then I would say it's probably good enough. If you don't have MDP monomer in your adhesive, I wouldn't use it as a silane. Now, Optibond XTR, all the Optibond products have a GDPM monomer, which is a little bit different. The MDP monomer came from Curare with their Clearfield products, right? And they were very, very effective for a very long time as the only one that had MDP. Well, the patent ran out, and MDP is now in a lot of different products out there. The Prime Bond Elect from Dentsply, that has the Penta, which is not the MDP. But I would go with anything, if you have MDP monomers in your adhesive, then you can use that as a predictable silane primer. Now, personally, I just go with a pure silane, so I don't have to ever worry about it. Bisco makes a silane that is just pure silane. It's just a porcelain primer, just pure silane. Now, pure silane, if it's combined, it basically has 2 components. And if it's combined in one bottle, you need to be careful because it has a shelf life and it can expire. If you want to extend that shelf life, you can do 2 things. 1, keep it refrigerated. 2, you can actually order the A and the B primer separate. And then when it's time to prime your restoration, then you add the A and the B together, mix them up, and prime the ceramic. Now, the advantage of that is that those 2, if you keep them separate, those are good for a very long time. The shelf life is very far extended. You don't have to really worry, is it still going to be good? It's going to be good for a long time. So that's my take on porcelain primers. Okay. Oh, someone had a great comment here. They said that it's not uncommon to see contaminants inside the crown from the lab, and sometimes it's on from the models or whatever it is. Is it okay to use a micro etcher to clean out the crown first? And if so, how does that change priming cementation with both Emax and zirconia? This is a great, great question. And you could definitely use sandblasting to get things clean. You can also use phosphoric acid etch to clean it. That also helps. And it transitions me perfectly into the way that I treat Emax. Now, a lot of people use sandblasting for Emax. Sandblasting is microetching with sand particles, definitely useful. Emax themselves, Ivoclar says specifically, we don't want you to sandblast our ceramics. But that being said, I've sandblasted them for years, never had any problems. I like to clean them that way, especially if they come off. We'll get into that if they come off. Hopefully I have time to cover that. But I definitely sandblast them. I think it's fine. But Ivoclar recommends just hydrofluoric acid etch. So first, etch it, get it all taken care of there, and then, I'm going to show you kind of a way that I do it, and then I'll tell you about alternative ways. So I etch it first, and then I try it in, do my adjustments, any occlusal adjustments. Then you can clean it with phosphoric acid. Okay, so I etch it with hydrofluoric acid, and then I try it in the mouth, and then I etch it with phosphoric acid to clean it up. And then I put my primer on. and I like to use multiple coats, right? At least for 30 seconds. I let it dry, maybe air dry it a little bit, and then you can use your cement. Now, alternatively, what are some of the other things that people ask? Someone asked, my Emax crowns come from the lab pre-etched. So how long do I etch after trying them out to clean the surface? So many times, labs will bring them back already etched, which is fine. And I would just try them in and then clean them with phosphoric acid afterwards. You don't have to etch it again with hydrofluoric. Now, sometimes the lab can silanate the crown. And it's a very good question here. It said, if the lab silanates your crown and it becomes contaminated with saliva, should I silanate a second time? Great question. The answer is, and Bisco did actually a lot of testing on this. They found that you can silanate it as soon as you get it back from the lab, or your lab can do it. And if it sits for a number of hours, even overnight, it actually works just as well as if you did it immediately. In fact, can even be better at times. So if you can remember to silanate it as soon as you get it back, that's fine. After you try it in, you can just clean it with phosphoric acid. It's not going to take the primer out. The primer is already set deep into the tooth. And excuse me. The primer is already deep into the ceramic, and it's still going to work. What I would probably use, instead of the other cleaners or rinsing it off, I would use Ivoclean. If your silane is already on the ceramic and you try it in and then you come back and you want to clean it, I would use Ivoclean. And we're going to talk about Ivoclean in just a minute, but I think that's probably the best cleaner that you could use for them. Okay, so that's how I treat my Emax. Now let's go to the metal, right? The non-glass containing ceramics. Zirconia, metals, alumina, and those are kind of a different category. The reason being is because you cannot etch the zirconia with hydrofluoric acid, right? It is not possible. It's because of the polycrystalline structure that's there. You can't do it. And so you have to rely on chemical bonding. Now, here's an interesting article that was published 12 years ago about, because there's a lot of confusion. Can you etch it? Can you etch it with airborne particle abrasion? And it's interesting that this study showed that hydrofluoric acid etching and airborne particle abrasion did not change the morphologic microstructure of zirconia. Here's another one about priming it. So they wanted to use a resin cement with a zirconia. And they found that silane improved resin bonding to silica-based ceramic, not a surprise. But that a phosphonic acid monomer was needed, or a phosphate ester monomer, right, was needed to improve the resin bonding to zirconia. So a different type of primer. Here's another one basically saying that the resin cements to zirconia didn't bond. You couldn't bond just the resin to it without a primer. If it had MDP, like Panavia, within the cement, it was better. But if you put on something like Z Prime, a specific primer for zirconia, it doubled the bond strength. People say, well, can I put a cojet on there? Well, you can, and it works a little bit. It's highly debated whether or not the cojet works, because you're trying to put silica onto the zirconia. But when using a zirconia-specific primer like Z Prime, bond strengths doubled. So there are a lot of them out there that say you can use it on zirconia, right? If it has MDP in the adhesive again, then I would say that's better. But there's AZ Primer by Shofu and Z Prime Plus by Bisco. Those are the really, really good zirconia-specific primers. And again, that's what I use. Now, zirconia primers, they help get the surface ready to bond to resins. A lot of people question, can you really do it? Well, when you put a zirconia primer on there, then you can. And again, it comes down to these phosphate groups. And here's why. Because saliva now plays a much bigger role. One of the things that happened early on with zirconia, layered zirconia, your lava crowns, was that people were using self-adhesive resin cements and they were coming off like crazy. And they didn't understand why. Why do my crowns keep coming off? What's the problem here? One of the things that happens, and this is why you would use Ivoclean, because of the contamination of the phospholipids in your saliva, taking up the phosphate group that should be reserved for the resin. All right, and I'm going to walk you through this. So here's a little video. So you take your zirconia, and when you try it in, you get saliva on the zirconia. Inside saliva, you have phospholipids. Now, phospholipids are have a high affinity to the zirconia because it wants those phosphate groups, right? And so when you would wash it out, all those phospholipids would still be stuck on the zirconia. And they would take up all the sites that were reserved for the resin, right? The phosphate groups of the resin. Now, to make matters worse, sometimes people would clean the inside of zirconia restoration with phosphoric acid cement. And that was terrible because then the phosphoric acid cement took up all of the sites that remained, and there wasn't all the phosphate groups in the phosphoric acid cement took up all the remaining sites, and you couldn't bond anything to it. So you wash it off. But what happens with the Ivoclean is that Ivoclean is pure zirconia. It is liquid zirconia. And so the phospholipids, if you wash it with Ivoclean, then the phospholipids have a higher affinity to the liquid zirconia. They come off the zirconium oxide ceramic onto the Ivoclean. Then you can wash that off, leaving all the sites now open and ready for your zirconia-specific primer, all those phosphate groups, and then you can put your resin cement right on top of that. All right? So that's how and why you use Ivoclean. And the zirconia primer works very, very well. Now, again, like I said before, lots of them out there. Lots of them claim you could do it. If it has MDP in it, okay, that's good, but the best is a zirconia-specific primer. Again, this is for non-retentive cementation. So this is how I treat my zirconia. Try it in, then I Ivoclean for 20 seconds. Then I put my primer back on for 30 seconds, zirconia specific. Then I can put my cement in. So here are the differences between Emax, glass ceramics, non-glass ceramics like zirconia. All right, the biggest thing about whether or not it can be etched by hydrofluoric acid and what primer you're going to use. Now, when it comes to the cements themselves, you have universal and also light cured. Now, whichever it is, I would use it with your adhesives. So as long as they're adhesive combined, you can use a universal resin or a light cured resin. Now, here's a good point about how to use your adhesives, right? Some of them are total etch, some of them are self etch. And with the new universal adhesives, which I'd love to talk about, but I'm not going to get too far into it, you can use universal adhesives in a total etch mode, a self etch mode, or a selective etch. For most of your full coverage crowns, you're in the vast majority indented. So here's a place where you can use your self-etching portion of your universal cements. Like, for example, this Dentsply one, Prime Bond Elect. Also, Optibond XTR, right? Perfect place to use it in your self-etch mode. So you take the crown off, and you're trying to clean off all the contaminants, right? Sometimes you have that black stuff over it. I like to use pumice and water, right, to really clean it out. Get a little abrasive, see how much contaminants you can get off there, all that bacteria. Now, a lot of people would advocate using chlorhexidine after you clean that off. And I also love chlorhexidine. I think it's a great cleaner. But if you are using a self-etch adhesive, you have to be careful with the effects that chlorhexidine can have on your self-etch adhesives. There was this really interesting study that came out a couple years ago about the bond durability when using chlorhexidine with self-etching adhesives. Basically, they found that if you use chlorhexidine to clean off the preparation, or this was also, you could say if you were just in your regular composite restorations, right? If you use chlorhexidine before you used self-etch adhesive, you significantly decrease the initial bond strength. Now they found after aging, after a long time, the bond strengths came back. But chlorhexidine associated with these self-etching adhesives shouldn't really be used. Here is very interesting photos about that. Here's the control without any chlorhexidine and self-etch adhesives. And here is a picture with chlorhexidine pre-treatment and then your self-etching adhesive. And you can see that breakdown there. So if this is a non-retentive crown prep that you're going to bond in the mouth, I would not use chlorhexidine before using a self-etching adhesive. All right, really good point there. Now again, here is a place where I love to use an isolite. If you are bonding, right, this is just like bonding a composite. You should have the area isolated very, very well. Okay? You should have it isolated very well so that you can use proper bonding technique. So you got it in there, you treated the silane, you clean it up, you're isolated, you put on your bonding agent, then you come in and you put the cement in, tack, cure it, 3 seconds or so, clean it up. Then I go back, buckle, lingual, cure, right? Now, just a couple notes about tack curing. You just got to be careful because if you have different osseous crest positions, you could have dangerous things about cement getting down below the gum line, which is just a nightmare, as seen by some of these really bad examples of cement down below the gum line. That's why I always take a second PA to make sure it's clean. You can see here, here to here. Yes, and I know that there's decay down here. We fix that up later. Also, here, right? This one I could floss fine, but in the x-ray, gotta clean it up. Here, again, I could floss fine. You gotta clean it up. So I just wanted to show you how I do it. So here I am using a self-etching adhesive. One of the important things here about self-etching adhesives is that you really got to scrub. Scrub. That's how you get self-etching adhesives to really work. You scrub them. Now it's better if they are more acidic. You can get those to work better, but you got to scrub. And then another thing is that you got to blow them with air. A good 5 seconds. Look how long I'm spending, because you got to get all of that. You want to get all of the. You want to get all the water, all the alcohol, acetone, all those carrying agents. You want to get those out. So you blow for a good 5 seconds. Okay, so once that's done, then I'm ready. Now this one has a dual cure activator, so I didn't cure it first. Here, with a resin cement, you have lots of time. So if you make a mistake like this and you put it on backwards like I just did, then you can still have time to put it on the right way. And then your patient won't be as upset. So here I am putting it on. This is with a resin cement. Now, you might be thinking, hey, you have tons of resistance retention form. And I do. But whenever an Emax is thin, like 1.5 millimeters or thinner, then I like to bond mine in. right? If it's a millimeter of thickness, I like to bond it in. Now you have plenty of time with the resin cements, especially if you're using the light cured only, you have tons of time to work. I like to clean up just a little bit if I'm cementing 2 at a time. I put them both in, make sure that they're seated properly. Nice firm seat. And then I come with the tack cure. I like just maybe 2-3 seconds with the tack cure, nothing more than that. Here I come. 1, 2, yeah, right about 2. 1, 2 on the lingual. And then I come and clean that on up. All right, and if you go longer than 2 or 3 seconds, oh, clean up the beast. And then you go and you floss it, get it all fixed up. There you go. There are Emax. There's a cementation process for Emax. All right, now I want to move to the retentive preps, the easy ones. So where you don't have to worry about primers, you don't have to worry about adhesive on the tooth, you can just get cements. And here is where you can use self-adhesive resin cements, resin-modified glass ionomers, or this new kind of cement called bioceramic cements. Now, self-adhesive resin cements, this is why I really don't use them very often. GSEM, Unisem, Maxem, look at their bond strengths here, right? In comparison to resin cements here, Panavia, Reliax, adhesive resin cement, look at their bond strengths and look at the bond strengths of these self-adhesive resin cements. That is why I don't use them for a non-retentive situation. If it's retentive, okay, you're not really banking on those bond strengths. And here's just another graphing representation of the vast difference between the bond strengths of self-adhesive resin cements and resin cements. Now, the advantage of self-adhesive resin cements is that you can bond them into place. They're very easy to use. You don't have to think very much. You can use them in an anterior situation for aesthetics. Disadvantage, isolation issues, you're still bonding, the bond strengths aren't very high, and the tack cure can be rock hard. As you and I both know, sometimes you get in those terrible situations where you tack cure it and it's super hard. Well, there is one, Calibre Universal, that they've come up with, and it's not quite as hard. In fact, you can, here's another little video. They say you can have up to 10 seconds. And I think that's a little generous. I would say maybe still in the 3-5 second range, but it's not as hard when you tack cure it. And you can see here in this video, watch how it bends. Do you see that? So for a resin cement to bend like that, that's pretty nice. So for self-adhesive resin cements, Calibre Universal is kind of a new one on the market, and that's their claim, is that it doesn't harden as quickly. Now, careful here. I want you to look at this. This came from Dentsply, and it shows where you can use certain cements. This is kind of their indication. What I think is interesting, because it says that you can't use a resin-modified glass iron or cement. Let me show you right here. It says you can't use a resin-modified glass iron or cement with all ceramic restorations, even in retentive preps. I think that's just silly, because I use it all the time, and I think it's fine. So I think you have to be careful here. It also says that you can use a self-adhesive resin cement in an inlay and onlay, and I don't think that is true. I think you need to use, I would say no, no, no here also. You need to use a resin cement with inlays and onlays. Now, here it is with the non-retentive preparation, and here at least they got this part right. They said no to all ceramic in a non-retentive prep. You shouldn't use a self-adhesive resin cement with all ceramic. What's crazy is that here they say yes, you can with zirconia, which is bizarre to me. I think if it's non-retentive, you need to use resin cement. That's just the bottom line. All right? Now, what about resin-modified glass ionomers? What about these? Are they still good? Absolutely. They have fluoride release, long history of use. They're super easy to use. Reliax has been great. Now, the reality is bond strengths were always better when they were kept separate. Now you have the paste tubes, which are good, but the when you triturated them and you had them in the triturator, they were always stronger because they always kept them separate. They weren't paste. You had powder liquid, and those were always stronger. Now the downside to resin modified glass ionomer cements is that they are acidic and they do uptake water, right? There's water absorption and they can expand a little bit. So that's not as good with resin modified glass ionomer cements. So here is a new category called bioceramics. And now I'm super excited about this category. It's called Ceramir. Now what this is essentially a product that can create new apatite crystals because of its makeup, right? The ceramic powder there has calcium oxide and aluminum oxide. And because of that, there's lots and lots of calcium, which is great. And that is great for creating new apatite crystals. And this is completely basic, right? It's an 8.5. It's neutral, right? It's not acidic, meaning that in the mouth, it's not going to break down because it's basic, right? You don't have to worry about all the different pH of the saliva. The best part about this is that it's bioactive. It actually can form apatite crystals with phosphates, meaning that you can have new nanocrystal formation with the tooth, with zirconia, with filler particles, anything that has phosphates, you can have new crystalline formation. I know it sounds too good to be true. It's crazy. Now, but it's working. And I'm going to show you this study. It's going to blow your mind. Now, Ceramir doesn't have incredible bond strength. It's not a resin cement. Here's a study that just shows that it's similar to Ketac Sem, a resin-modified glass ionomer cement in enamel. It's much better than Dentin. Very similar to alumina, better in zirconia. But again, we're talking about 8 to 6. I mean, not high bond strengths, right? Because this is to be used in retentive preparations. For zirconia, now because of the phosphates, remember, right? Phosphate groups in zirconia. That's why Ceramir bonds so well to it. So you can get really, really high bond strengths to the zirconia. But again, if it's not retentive, then I still wouldn't use it. But it bonds very well to zirconia because of the phosphate groups. Now here are images of crystalline nanocrystal particle formation. You can see between the tooth and the substrate, you have these crystals formed. So here is a study. It just came out in May. It's absolutely amazing. And what it shows is whether or not bioactive dental cements have the ability to seal marginal gaps as compared with other dental cements. They basically found that bioactive surface apatite forming cements demonstrated that you could actually occlude artificial marginal gaps. So we all know that our crowns don't fit perfectly, right? There's always some gap there. No matter how good, how accurate our crowns are, there's always a little bit of a gap. So they tested it. They used all of these different types. They used Reliax Unicem. They used Reliax Luting, right? Reliax Unicem, self-adhesive resin cement. Reliax Luting, resin modified glass ionomer cement. A glass ionomer cement, Fuji 1. Ceramir and MTA. Now both Ceramir and MTA are bioactive. MTA ProRoot, right? What you use in endo. And what they wanted to find is they had gaps. And how quickly could those gaps be filled? If you look here, baseline, 7 days, 31 days, of course that gap isn't being filled by the self-adhesive resin cement. But with the bioactive cements, at 7 days, you already had crystalline formation. At 23 days, 30 days, look at that. Unbelievable. I'm going to show you another image here. Oh, let me go back here. Here's Ceramir, right? For Ceramir alone, here's baseline. Look at that gap. 4 days, 5 days, 18 days, 48 days. Look at that. I just couldn't believe what I saw, that you can actually occlude an artificial gap with this cement. Here's another one that shows at 8 months, right? At 8 months, here's the glass ionomer cement. Here's resin modified glass ionomer, because of course they're not bioactive. They can't form new apatite crystals. And MTA, this bioceramic material, and Ceramire can actually occlude. They can fill the gap. For me, that was the biggest selling point. I could not believe how important that was for me. That with artificial gaps, you could actually close the space with these new bioactive cements. So basically, the preliminary findings of this initial study suggest the possible capability of surface apatite forming calcium-based, right, tons of calcium, bioactive dental cements to seal or reseal artificial marginal gaps. Is that not unbelievable? So I've been using Ceramire for quite a while, and it's super easy to use. You take your ceramic, right, Emax or zirconia, and you don't have to prime it because it's retentive. You can see how retentive this prep is, right? So I can use any type of retentive cement in this situation. I could use a self-adhesive resin cement. I could use a resin-modified glass ionomer cement, or I could use a bioactive cement. So I just fill it up. After I try it in, I make my adjustments. I fill it up with Ceramire, then I put it on. Now, with any cement, both resin, dual cured, self-adhesive resin cements, resin modified glass ionomer cements, bioactive cements, it is super important that when you seat the crown, you do not make adjustments for a good full 4 to 5 minutes, because you have to allow this full chemical cure to happen. Another reason why crowns are falling off is because people start to manipulate them too early. I put it in, maybe I'll floss my contacts to make sure it doesn't get stuck. I put it in a cotton roll and I just let it sit. You just gotta let it sit for 4 to 5 minutes. I get up and I walk away because I'm so ADD that I'm gonna wanna play with it. So I make sure that I just have them bite together. I have my assistant monitor them. I get up and go so I don't touch it, and I come back when it is a full set before I make any adjustments. And then you can clean it up, and there it is. Super easy to use. Now, I clean, that being said, that's before making adjustments. In the cleanup, sorry, maybe I confuse people. In the cleanup, I would clean up about the 2-minute mark. All right, I let it sit there, clean it up, but I don't make any adjustments, any occlusal adjustments for the 4 minutes. So here's a video of after the 2-minute set, right? Look at how spongy this is. I love this. Right at the 2-minute set, the cleanup is so nice. Look at that bend. This is Ceramire right here. This is a bridge. Look at this. Look at that bend. Look at that. Right at the 2-minute mark. So the 2-minute mark, I clean up, and then I put the cotton roll back in, and I have them bite down for the rest of the 2 minutes, at least 4 minutes before I adjust anything, even up to 6 minutes. All right? So here's the review. Get ready. Super difficult. Retentive cementation procedure. I try it in. I put in Ceramire or your resin modified glass ionomer cement or self-adhesive resin cement, and then you clean it up. So for my just reviewing backwards, right? Reviewing backwards, non-retentive cementation, Emax, zirconia, and then what you have to do with either of those on the tooth, right? Your adhesive on the tooth, dual cure resin, tack cure it, full cure, and then your x-ray to make sure it's clean. And then the retentive, a lot easier. But again, whether it's retentive or non-retentive, I always take, sorry, should have put an x-ray there because you can always get cement that's down there. You can never leave cement down there. So you got to make sure you take an x-ray. Post-operative cementation x-ray is vital. I used to not take them all the time when I was early on in practice, and I got burned, and then there was inflammation under the gums when they came back, and it was just terrible. I'm telling you, take that x-ray right afterwards, okay? Make sure you take that x-ray, you get it all out of there. So again, in your 4 main categories, your resin cements, self-adhesive resin cements, resin-modified glass hammer cements, bioceramic cements, I think that you can use all of those well. It's understanding that if it's a non-retentive preparation, that's when I would use resin cements. I love resin cements for non-retentive preparations. And you use the appropriate primer, right? Use the appropriate adhesive on the tooth and use a resin cement and you're going to be great. I also use those with Emax when they're less than 1.5 millimeters in width. For self-adhesive resin cements, resin-modified glass ionomer cements, and bioceramic cements, I use those in retentive situations, right? With either zirconia or glass. You can use them in either way, right? But those are only for your retentive situations. All right, here's my email address.